So, dear friends, we are 3 weeks into the war, and I'd like to talk about something I don't often talk about, and I want to explain why. I call it the hints in the Bible to current events. It's one of the codes what we're used to as Jews, even though we don't talk about it too much, because there's a lot about it we don't understand ourselves. But especially here in Israel, it seems to emerge every now and then when we have a very specific, when we have, I would call, a major event in our history. And we are at a moment now, a watershed moment, which is a major event to such an extent that sometimes the people feel it and they don't even understand how they know that. I can tell you days after October 7th, which was what a lot of people are calling the Black Sabbath, because of the terrible tragedy that happened on that day, people were saying, we're not the same as a country. Something has changed and it will remain in such a way. And even without people knowing exactly what is going to change. But there was this like deep soul feeling within the national identity of the country that something was happening and something was changing. And so too, when a major event happens, it is sometimes reflected in reading of the portion of the week, or sometimes even in the reading of the prophet that we read from the week. Portion of the week is from the 5 books of the Torah. Now we read every year the Torah over and over again, so that it's sort of like programmed, according to each week, which in advance, according to the calendar, which one we're going to read. So that's why it's unusual that actually anything should be able to be understood from the weekly portion. Theoretically, it doesn't make any sense. But for some uncanny reason, these things happen. And sometimes when major events happen, they stand out and shout at us almost from the text. And I want to give an example of something that I think I'm not the only one. Others have noticed this too, how uncanny it is. So I'm going to explain. I'm going to go slowly, and you'll see how it builds up and how it gets weirder and weirder as things go on. It was also mentioned by the Vilna Gaon 200 years ago. He died in 1797, Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman, who said that all of history is hinted in the 5 books of Moses in the Pentateuch. And and he even said every person who lives is hinted. Somebody even asked him where he's mentioned, he gave him the verse. Of course, you have to be on a very high level to understand things like that. I couldn't tell you where every person is mentioned in the Bible. Certain unique individuals. Vilna Gaon, who was both a legalist and a Kabbalist, he had these inner perceptions and understanding of things. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson of Chabad, also said that you can look into the weekly portion of the reading of the Torah and see things about that week. So I'm sure he could. Sometimes we don't always see it, but again, when a major event happens, things happen. Rabbi Cook, Abraham Isaac Cook, who died in 1935, experienced the First World War, but not the Second. He said about the First World War, when a great war happens, this arouses the redemptive process, or what he calls the messianic light. Because something shakes when there's an earthquake in humanity. It's sort of like humanity searching for the redemptive part within its collective soul. So when we feel this earthquake, and this was more than just the tremor which happened on October 7th, where everybody felt that this slaughter, this massacre, affected them. So something happened to us. I just want to bring this out according to the Parsha, the portion of the week, demonstrate how this happened. Now, let me just explain something first. October 7th was for us, it was a Sabbath, and here in Israel, it was Shmini Atzeret, the last, it's actually a holiday by itself, but it's sort of the last day of the of the holiday of Sukkot, of Tabernacles, where we're not sitting in the booth anymore, but we are. It's a day, a special day. It's called Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly. And it's also when we restart reading the Torah, we end off the 5 books of Moses and start again. So it's also called the day of the celebration of the Torah, Simchat Torah. So we read 2 things actually on that day on the Bible. First, we read the piece which talks about Simchat Torah, which talks about Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day. In our tradition, the meaning of the 8th day, we have this tradition that God says we gave 70 offerings in the temple over the 7 days of tabernacles. And this represents the 70 nations according to our rabbinic tradition. So we were doing it for the nations. And then God says to us, as if on the 7th day, let's have an assembly, just us. So this is the day when the Jewish people have to pull together. There was a lot of divisiveness in Israel over the last year. And on that day of Shmini Atzeret, we read from the Torah, according to our tradition, this is the day when the Jewish people have to pull themselves together. I have to say that the tragedy of that day, if there was any light at the end of the tunnel, it was the fact that the whole people of Israel, and maybe the Jewish people all over the world, were able to pull themselves together to find what unites us over that which divides, because the divisions are trivial politics very often. That was the first Torah reading. Now follow me. The second thing we read is Genesis, but we only read Genesis on that particular day until the end of chapter 1, which is the beginning of the Torah. Now, if you remember how Genesis starts, and the land was chaos. I don't know if you know, but Israelis, when they talk about the land of Israel, they call it the land. They say, I'm in the land, ani ba'aretz. I'm not in the land now, ani lo ba'aretz. So we refer to it as the land. And the Torah says on the land, the earth, the land was in chaos. And then God said, let there be light. So you have your chaos. And after chaos, God says, let there be light. That's how it starts. I also want to mention one other thing. There's a famous rabbinic interpretation on that first verse of the Bible. And in that rabbinic interpretation brought down by Rashi from the 11th century, but already mentioned in the Midrash Rabbah on Genesis Rabbah. But Rashi asked the question, why is it that the Torah starts from Bereshit? Why does it have to start from Genesis? Why doesn't it start from Exodus chapter 12, which talks about the commandments? Rashi says, because the day is going to come when the nations will say, you stole the land of Israel. It doesn't belong to you. The Jews will say, what do you mean we stole it? God created the universe. It says in the Bible, he gave us the land of Israel. Why do you say you stole it? And this is exactly what happened. We had a war that started October 7th, claiming that we stole the land. In every generation, if there's any people indigenous to the land of Israel, it's the people of Israel, of course. That's why we're called Israel, and the land is called Israel. We are the people of Israel. And every time we get banished from here because another empire comes and tries to knock us out, when we try to come back, people tell us we're not indigenous. You ran away. We didn't run away. We were pushed away. But anyhow, this is the first part where we read. Then, the next week after, we read Genesis, the pericopa, or the parsha of the rest of Genesis, the next Sabbath. If you remember that next Sabbath, there wasn't yet any major military action. In that, there's a story though, in Genesis 1. So as we start figuring out what happened during that week, because a lot of things were not understood. When we read the Torah on that first Shabbat, it talks about Cain killing Abel, the first homicide in the history of man, and that's when we discover how many people were actually killed on October 7th. It took a whole week to figure that out. I want to jump to the most significant thing, which is the week after that, the pericopa, the portion of Noah, and the story of the flood. During that week, we are bombarded with bombs from Gaza. Until today, which is 3 weeks later, 8,000 rockets were sent into Israeli cities, bombarding the cities to try to overwhelm the Iron Dome. Houses were hit, people were injured. And all that happens as we're reading the Torah reading a little over a week ago of Noah. And Noah's about the flood. Let me just show you how unusual this is. It says here, this is chapter 6 in Genesis. These are the generation of Noah. Remember, Noah's about a flood, and he has to close himself up because he has to keep away from the waters from the flood. Just like all the Israelis are being attacked by rockets and they have to go into secure rooms. And by the way, the Hamas called this operation the operation of the flood of Al-Aqsa. They actually called it the flood of Al-Aqsa. They were going to flood Israel with rockets, with terrorists. So look what it says here. And if you can follow in the Hebrew, it's even amazing. These are the generations of Noah. Noah and his generation was righteous and wholehearted. And Noah begot 3 children, Shem, Ham, and Yefet. And the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Let me now read that in the Hebrew. The world was corrupt. Ifnei ha'Elohim, before God. But timalei haaretz, and the world was filled with Hamas. Yes, you can check the Hebrew. That's exactly what it says. The earth was filled with violence. The Hebrew word is Hamas. If that's not weird, look at the continuation. Verse 13, God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the world is filled with violence. Again in Hebrew, al-aretz Hamas, filled with Hamas. And I will destroy them with the earth, because Israel is being attacked all over Hamas, and it's reverberating over all of the countries all over. And then what happens? As we're being attacked by Hamas, we get visitors from, I have to tell you something else, which is even more eerie. There is a translation of the Torah. And this translation, which was the first sanctioned translation of the Bible into Aramaic in the 1st century, a convert whose name was Onkelos. It's read by most Jews when they want to understand the meaning of the verses, Onkelos. Some places, like among the Yemenite Jews, it's actually read in the synagogue. I want to show you the translation of Onkelos to the verses I have just read. Okay, I'm going to try to show this to you, if possible, exactly how this works. Just read before, verse 11, and the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence, which is, in the Hebrew says Hamas, it was filled with Hamas. But if you read the official translation in Aramaic from the 1st century, from Temple Times, so it's very interesting what it actually says here. Let me open it up for you for a moment. You can see it. Unfortunately, I have it only in the Aramaic. So this is verse 11. He says, "V'it chaba," and again, and the world was corrupt before God and filled with evil. Translate "V'it chabalat ara," which is corrupt in Aramaic, but it's also in Hebrew. "It chabalat" comes from the word mechabel, which means terrorists. which means the land was terroristic. And the land was filled with, instead of corruption, he writes chatofim, which in modern Hebrew actually means kidnapping, which is really eerie, because that reminds exactly what happened. He says it a second time too. He mentions the word Hamas a second time. So this is quite, call it eerie. I have no other word for it. Let's just look again in Noach. What happens in Noach after the flood? If you remember, you have the Tower of Babel, where all these different languages, everybody's speaking a different language. And if you remember that week, we had the president of the United States come, and then we had President Macron come, and we had the Prime Minister of England, and we had the Chancellor of Germany, and the President of Romania. I mean, we had like everybody coming to Israel, all the different languages and all the different peoples, just like a sort of Tower of Babel was happening during that time. And then we come to this past portion, which is called Parshat Lech Lecha, which is Genesis 12, which we just read yesterday. Today is Sunday. Just read yesterday. And it starts off that God says to Abraham, go from your house, and I will show it to you. This is chapter 12 in Genesis, so that you can see it exactly where we are. Chapter 12 in Genesis. Just bear with me for one moment, and we'll find it. So here we have chapter 12, which is what we read this past Sabbath. And God said to Abraham, get out of your country. He was living in Ur-Kasdim, in Mesopotamia, from your Kidron, from your father's house, into the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make my name great, and you shall be a blessing. So God says to Abraham, it's time to go to the land of Israel, which means that this is all happening because of the land of Israel. And that's where we're reading this past Sabbath. And then we read that there is a major battle. Chapter 14 in the same portion. Chapter 14. Let me show it to you. Have your chapter 14. In the same portion we read. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, the king of Shinar, and the king of Elasar, and there was a king of Elam and the king of Goyim. They all made a war against the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, etc. You have this war, the four kings who come from the north. By the way, where do they come from the north? They come from Shinar, which is Iraq, and Elam, which is basically Iran. So they're coming from the areas of Iraq and Iran, and they are coming to make war here in Israel, which of course we know that the war that we entered a few days ago, which is our reprisal war against Hamas, all of a sudden, it became a sort of regional war. Iran is behind everything. And then they have the Hezbollah attacking us from the north. And they have the Gazans from the south. And they wanted the Houthi in Yemen to fire missiles at us. And also their men in Syria and Iraq to follow, to send missiles at us. And because of that, the US got involved and Russia got involved on that side. And then France got involved in England. And on that side, it was China and Turkey. And it looks like a sort of regional war. And here you have in chapter 14, what we just read this past Shabbat, a regional war which takes place around the land of Israel from these four kings coming from the area of Mesopotamia, which is Iran, Iraq today. Now, if that's not more crazy, let me just go a little bit further. Then in the same portion of last week, in chapter 16, again, you have something a little bit uncanny. First of all, in chapter 15, God makes a promise to Abraham. Don't worry, Abraham, I will give you the land, and I promise that your seed, your offspring shall be in the land. So don't worry. No, you had a war. Don't worry about it. Land will be yours. Then, chapter 16, also we read this last Sabbath. is the famous story of Sarah. She takes her maidservant and gives her Hagar to Abraham and says, I want you to have a son because I'm barren. And Abraham has a child. The child's name is Yishmael. But Hagar, instead of being nice to Sarah, she starts to despise her. Sarah said to Abraham, says about Hagar, you see, she conceived, and when she saw she conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. She started not liking. By the way, Hagar is the mother of Ishmael, which is, of course, the forerunner of the Arab nation. And by the way, the Arabs themselves say that. It's not just the Bible. And then Sarah says to Abraham, my wrong is upon you. I gave you my handmaid into my bosom, your bosom. And when she saw that she conceived, she despised me. May the Lord judge between us. In Hebrew, Sarah said to Abraham, Hamasi alecha. Hamas is upon you, meaning what it says here, my wrong is upon you. It's your fault. I gave you in good faith this woman. Now she has a son, and it's brought Hamas. The son, of course, is the father of the Arab tribes. Abraham says to her, look, this is your maiden, do what you want. And so Sarah deals harshly with her, and she flees into the desert. In the desert, she meets the angel of God by the fountain in the wilderness. And the angel says, Hagar, where are you coming from? She says, I'm fleeing from Sarah, my mistress. The angel says, go back to your mistress. Submit to her. Hagar, I'm sure, is shocked about that. The angel says, I will multiply thy seed. You'll have many children coming out of thy Ishmael. Because you will have a son. His name will be Ishmael. She already had. Because, of course, he just wasn't born yet. Because the Lord has heard your affliction. Be a wild man. His hand will be everywhere. And every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell on the face of all of his brethren. And then Hagar, the mother, called out to God and said, God, you are my God of seeing. Have I even ever seen that seeth me? She called this place God sees. That's what it says in Hebrew. He called the God who spoke to her, you are the God that sees. Which means, and the angel said to her, you want to see? Because he's called Yishmael, which means I will hear God. You want to see? Go back to Sarah. Even if it's difficult, she can give you a vision. She can give you a way to go. We haven't read next week's portion yet. In the middle of a war. But next week's portion, Hagar does come back. And Ishmael, the child, is born. And again, there's a fallout between Sarah and Hagar. Because Sarah says, I don't want the Ishmael to have a bad influence on Isaac. She says to Abraham, I want you to expel her back into the desert. Abraham is shocked. Turns to God, he says, what's going on? I don't want to expel her. God says, whatever Sarah says, that's what you have to do. But there's much more to this. I don't want to go too further because it's hard to know. But all the chapters that have to do with the relationship between the Jews and the Arabs are right here in this pericopa, in this portion of Lech Lecha, which starts from Genesis 12 and continues into Vayera next week. These are the chapters of the relationship between the Israelites and the Arabs, the children of Ishmael. And I'll just say one thing, just to end up and optimistic. It seems to be two relationships that Sarah has to Hagar. One of them is Hagar runs away because she has a difficult time. The angel says, go back. You need her. You need that relationship with her. She will redeem you. And then when Sarah says, I just can't deal with it. I guess sometimes we try to redeem and sometimes we can't deal with it. But ultimately, in our tradition, Sarah's son Isaac takes a liking to Ishmael. And he spends time with him. But I want to talk about this now. It's coming up in two pericopas. It's called Chayei Sarah. And he tries to bring Ishmael back. And according to the Midrash, rabbinic interpretations, he is successful. which means that if we try, there can be light in the tunnel. So we will have fights. We will sometimes not get along. Sometimes they won't get along with us. Sometimes we won't get along with them, but there is light in the end of the tunnel, but we have to do it right. And there are things that we have to understand in these portions, what's going on in order to understand how exactly to do it right. But I don't know yet because it hasn't happened yet. So I will try to give a follow-up in a week or two, tell you how I see these things in the portion. And I think everybody's seeing it. I don't see myself as being unusual in this thing, just reading what is in front of me. And I wish peace on Israel, peace on the Middle East, and peace over all of humanity. Shalom.